Yes, ma'am.
Okay, how did it happen that you had the opportunity to do the Louisiana Purchase?
How did it happen? Our nation had the opportunity. I just happened to be in the office of Chief Magistrate at the time.
Okay.
I was not there initially when we began to learn of a secret treaty between Spain and France. We knew the elements of the secret treaty allowed for Spain to retrocede the island of New Orleans. That is all. And therefore, at the same time we learned that, Spain denied our right of deposit on the island of New Orleans. By that simply, the free trade on the Mississippi, perhaps the greatest artery of commerce upon this globe, had been a beacon light that was wont to entice the migration of our population westward across this continent, that our farmers could venture west and still allow an artery for their trade along the Mississippi. If there were an overabundance of produce, they could place it in warehouses in New Orleans, continue their trade, pick up whatever they wanted to, whenever they should choose, to sail out of the Delta and trade with the rest of the world. Spain ended that. That ended, if you will, a laissez-faire economy out west. We immediately became concerned, rather than to aggress upon Spain, though I will say I had the idea, and I will mention that in a moment, we had the concern to discover another artery of commerce. We all felt it would be the Missouri, that the Missouri might cut through the Stony Mountains and connect with the Great Western Ocean. And that is the reason that I initially commissioned the expedition led by Captain Lewis, which, if you may know, was equipped here initially. But at the same time, I became concerned that that France, in its aggressions throughout the kingdoms of Europe, particularly under General Bonaparte, might attempt aggression upon our western borders. So I had the idea to conquer New Orleans, simply take it over. A gentleman that I met, I was introduced to him by Dr. Franklin in the Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris. This gentleman persuaded me nay. In fact, he had already arrived in our nation after near 15 years. He came here with 2 sons, and he was the one, a well-respected banker and physiocrat in Paris, who said, "No, Monsieur Jefferson, you will flatter the French far more by offering to purchase." By that time, I was in the capacity as President of the United States. Anyone know who this gentleman was? A friend of our nation. No, good friend of Lafayette. No, good friend of Monsieur Gallatin. No, Monsieur Pierre Samuel Dupont. Monsieur Dupont. His 2 boys have been most prosperous. Victoire in woolen mills and Eliotea in gunpowder refining. So, madam, if you will, with the idea that we should pursue peaceable negotiations with France, I commissioned my old friend Robert Livingston of New York, former collaborator on our declaration, as Minister Plenipotentiary to France. I even wrote a letter that I wanted him to hand to General Bonaparte, in which I said, whoever occupies the island of New Orleans will be the natural enemy of the United States, and we may have to marry ourselves with the British. You know who handed the letter to Bonaparte? It wasn't Livingston. He was intercepted. Dupont sailed back to France and handed the letter to General Bonaparte, and heard immediately his concern. Well, perhaps, as I would, if this is to be negotiation in finance, so that I could use the money, perhaps I'll relieve myself of the entire territory of Louisiana. France had not occupied nor owned them for many, many years, since the 7 Years' War. So here was an opportunity. Now, I suggested to Mr. Livingston that we do not offer a purchase price above $9 million. We only had $17 million in our treasury at that time. In fact, we still do. And so Bonaparte was the first who called for $22 million as the purchase price. Livingston counted at $12 million, so he went over my initial suggestion. Bonaparte recounted at 15, and Livingston struck while the iron was hot. Now remember, he was minister plenipotentiary, all potentiary powers. He held all powers of the Congress to negotiate. And so the treaty was drawn up in English, no, French first. That was the 30th of April, 1803, I'm told. 3 days later in English. I am also told by Mr. Livingston and the Marquis Barbé de Bois, who was present, that when Bonaparte signed the first treaty in French, he pronounced in perfect English, "I now create the United States of America a future world power."
Wow.
And we did not hear anything about this till the end of June, when the news sailed back across the ocean, and then the actual treaties arrived in Washington City the 14th day of July, 1803. Is that not coincident? Bastille Day.
Oh, yeah.
And of course it went to my desk, but the Federalist would want you to think it stayed there, and I simply signed off on it. Absolutely not. We followed our Constitution, which states distinctly, any treaty for ratification proceeds where? The Senate, and that is exactly where it went. Now, do we forget back in '03, the Federalists in the Senate would not compromise with the Republicans. They argued and debated. They said this is a government expenditure for a wasteland.
Oh, wow.
Now, you know what they saw. They saw, as I pronounced, the settlement to the 100th and 1000th generation of farmers. Do you know who helped to reconcile that argument and debate in Congress more than anyone else? It's astounding. I hope we do not forget. One completely opposed to my political ideas of political economy, General Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton had the vision not only to see agriculture on the horizon, but they're going to need banks. And I am not opposed to neighborhood banks and county banks that help the investor learn how to work with their money. It's the idea of a national bank that I'm opposed to, but Hamilton had that vision. And happy for him that we were able to reconcile this. Now, with respect to the expenditure, we relaxed $2 million of debt that were owed to us by the French for the Quasi-War back in the 90s. They'd left us a balance of 13. About $3.5 million were given to us by Hope and Company, the Dutch bank in Amsterdam that helped to finance, one of the banks that helped to finance the American Revolution. Those were 30-year loans at 6% interest. And then the greater balance came to us in the form of loans from Baring and Company, the Dutch bank, the British bank in London. So our old enemy, England, gave us the money to double, triple the size of our nation, the greater majority of that balance, and we turned it around and gave it to the French. Again, politics as usual. Wow. In that respect. Well,